A ruthless cutoff isn't cruelty, it's clarity. You stopped negotiating for the basics and chose peace. And I need you to feel the weight of that sentence in your chest. Because for so long you've been trained to believe that choosing yourself is somehow harsh. You've been trained to believe that if you stop explaining, if you stop replying, if you stop forgiving, if you stop giving chances, you are being cold. But the truth is, you weren't cold, you were exhausted. You weren't ruthless, you were depleted. You weren't trying to punish anyone, you were trying to stop bleeding in private. Clarity is what happens when your heart finally accepts what your nervous system has been screaming for months. This doesn't feel safe. Clarity is what happens when you stop confusing anxiety with love. Clarity is what happens when you realize you've been negotiating for things that should never require negotiation. Communication, consistency, respect, basic consideration. And what's heartbreaking is that you probably didn't even ask for much. You weren't asking for perfection. You weren't asking for constant attention. You were asking not to be left in emotional suspense. You were asking not to be punished with silence. You were asking not to feel alone inside a relationship. But when you love someone avoidant, you learn to live in the in-between. In between warmth and distance. In between connection and disappearance. In between I miss you and I need space. In between promises and excuses. And you start bargaining with that in between as if it's normal. As if love is supposed to feel like waiting outside someone's door. And you become so good at waiting that you forget what it feels like to be met. So when you cut it off, it doesn't come from nowhere. It comes from 1,000 tiny moments where you felt your dignity slipping. It comes from the late nights where you stared at your phone and felt ashamed for hoping. It comes from the mornings where you woke up with heaviness in your chest because you knew you were going to spend another day guessing. It comes from the moments you tried to communicate calmly and still got distance in return. It comes from the times you told yourself, maybe I'm asking too much, maybe I'm too sensitive, maybe I should be more understanding, while a part of you quietly knew, no, I'm asking for the basics. A ruthless cutoff is clarity because it stops the negotiation. Negotiation is when you keep trying to convince someone to treat you well. Negotiation is when you keep writing paragraphs to be understood by someone who keeps choosing not to understand. Negotiation is when you keep accepting apologies with no behavioral change. Negotiation is when you keep lowering your needs to fit inside someone else's comfort zone. Negotiation is when you keep offering access to your heart without requiring them to handle it carefully. And clarity is when you say, I'm done doing that. I'm done turning my needs into a debate. I'm done making my self-worth dependent on someone's mood. And I know what your mind does when you choose clarity. It tries to guilt you. It tries to romanticize. It tries to remind you of the good moments. It tries to make you feel like a villain for having standards. It tries to tell you that love means staying, that loyalty means tolerating, that compassion means endless chances. But compassion without boundaries becomes self-betrayal. Loyalty without reciprocity becomes self-erasure. And love without respect becomes a lesson in how to abandon yourself while calling it devotion. Clarity is you choosing peace. Peace is not a dramatic feeling at first. Peace can feel like grief. Peace can feel like emptiness. Peace can feel like withdrawal. Because when you've been living in emotional chaos, calm feels strange. When you've been addicted to the highs and lows, steadiness feels boring. When your nervous system has been scanning for danger, silence feels like danger even when it's healthy silence. So choosing peace often feels painful in the beginning, because you are detoxing from a pattern that kept you hooked. Hope, contact, withdrawal, anxiety, relief, repeat. But peace is what your body has been craving. Peace is waking up and not checking your phone like it decides your worth. Peace is not having to decode a message for hidden meaning. Peace is not living in anticipation. Peace is being able to eat, sleep, work, laugh without a constant ache underneath. Peace is feeling like you belong to yourself again. Peace is not having to perform, cool, while your heart is drowning. Peace is having your own back. And here is why clarity feels ruthless to an avoidant, because your clarity removes the comfort of your flexibility. Your clarity removes the cushion of your forgiveness. Your clarity removes the privilege of your patience. They were used to you bending. They were used to you making room. They were used to you understanding them at the expense of understanding yourself. And when you stop, it can look shocking. Because you stopped being the person they could come and go with. But that shock is not proof that you became cruel. It's proof that you stopped being convenient. Clarity also protects you from the trap of temporary effort. Because once you cut it off, they may reach out. They may suddenly become intense. They may suddenly become sweet. And that sweetness can feel like proof that you did the right thing. but clarity keeps you grounded. It reminds you that intensity is not consistency. Clarity reminds you that missing you is not accountability. Clarity reminds you that contact is not commitment. Clarity reminds you that the only return that matters is the one that comes with repair, with humility, with sustained change. And if they never return, clarity still saves you, because it ends the slow death of your self-respect. It ends the pattern of waiting. It ends the quiet humiliation of accepting crumbs. It ends the habit of living for someone else's attention. It ends the constant internal negotiation where you argue with your own needs. It ends the emotional poverty where you feel grateful for basic decency. So if someone calls your cutoff ruthless, let them. Let it sound ruthless to anyone who benefited from you having no boundaries. Let it look ruthless to anyone who thought you would stay through anything. Let it feel ruthless to the part of you that is still scared of losing them, because that part of you is not bad, it's just wounded. But you are not here to live wounded forever. You are here to heal, and healing requires clarity. Clarity says, I am not available for disappearing love. Clarity says, I will not keep negotiating for the basics. Clarity says, I can love someone and still choose peace. And that is not cruelty, it is the deepest form of self-respect. The kind that doesn't scream, the kind that simply closes the door, locks it, and finally rests. Avoidance gets shocked, because your old pattern was availability, and your new pattern is boundaries with consequences, and that shift can feel like an earthquake to someone who was living off the comfort of your predictability. Because the truth is, they weren't just attached to you, they were attached to the way you stayed. They were attached to the way you made it easy. They were attached to the way you reopened the door after they closed it. They were attached to the way you explained your pain softly, so they didn't have to feel guilty. They were attached to the way you kept trying, even when they gave you so little to hold on to. And you did that because you cared. You did that because you saw potential. You did that because you didn't want to be the person who gives up. You did that because you told yourself, if I just hold steady, they'll feel safe enough to stay. But your steady turned into self-abandonment, and their safety turned into entitlement. Not always intentional, but the pattern became, I pull away, you come closer, I go quiet, you fill the silence, I disappear, you forgive. I return, you soften. And that pattern trained them to believe something dangerous, that your availability was permanent. So when you change, of course they're shocked. They're shocked because they were used to a version of you that could be relied on to keep the connection alive, no matter what. They're shocked because your love used to absorb the consequences for them. They're shocked because your patience used to erase their responsibility. They're shocked because your empathy used to protect them from the discomfort of accountability. And when you stop doing that, they lose the emotional insurance policy they didn't even realize they were holding. Availability without boundaries can become a silent promise. You can treat me however you want and I'll still be here. You would never say that out loud, but your behavior can accidentally communicate it. Every time you answered right away after being ignored, every time you accepted a vague apology, every time you reconnected without repair, every time you let them return without naming what happened, you taught the nervous system, it's safe to keep doing this, because nothing is lost. And if nothing is lost, nothing has to change. Boundaries with consequences are what finally interrupt that comfort. A boundary is not you saying, I don't like this. A boundary is you saying, I won't participate in this, and then living it. A consequence is not punishment, it's a reality. It's the reality that access to you is not automatic anymore. It's the reality that disappearing acts cost something. It's the reality that love is not free entry into your life without respect. And the avoidant gets shocked because consequences are unfamiliar in a dynamic where you used to cushion everything. This is why, when you cut off cleanly, you often see the sudden shift. They might act confused. They might act offended. They might act like you're being dramatic. They might say, you've changed. And yes, you have changed. You changed because you had to. You changed because staying the same was costing you your peace. You changed because you finally realized that being endlessly available to someone who is inconsistently present is a form of self-harm. You changed because your nervous system got tired of living in suspense. And when you change, the avoidant loses control over the distance. Distance is where they feel safe. Distance is where they feel regulated. Distance is where they feel powerful, even if they don't mean to. Because the person who can leave without shaking becomes the person who controls the dynamic. And for a long time, they could leave and still feel you there. They could withdraw and still know you'd keep the door cracked open. They could return and still find warmth waiting. That's why your boundaries with consequences shock them, because now distance has a cost. Now withdrawal might lead to loss. Now silence might lead to a closed door. Now space might lead to you moving on. But here is where you must be careful, because shock can produce chasing, and chasing can look like change. When they feel the door closing, they may suddenly reach out. They may suddenly become intense. They may suddenly become sweet. They may suddenly say all the right things. And your heart, because it is tired and tender, might want to believe it. It might want to say, finally they see me. But the question is not whether they can chase when they feel they're losing you. The question is whether they can show up when it's no longer urgent. Whether they can stay consistent when the panic fades. Whether they can remain present after they regain a sense of safety. Because avoidant patterns can chase in fear, and then withdraw again when intimacy requires responsibility. That's why your consequences must remain steady. Steady doesn't mean harsh. It means clear. It means you don't get pulled back into the old cycle because of a burst of attention. It means you don't reopen the door without repair. It means you don't hand them full access because they sent a message. It means you protect your standards even when your heart is aching. And yes, that is difficult, because the old version of you was trained to prioritize connection over self-respect. But the new version of you is learning the opposite. That real connection cannot be built on your self-abandonment. And this is the deepest truth. Your boundaries aren't just shocking to them, they are healing to you. They teach your nervous system, I am safe with myself. They teach your heart, I don't have to beg for the basics. They teach your identity, I am not an option. They teach your future, I will not build a life around someone's inconsistency. Every consequence you enforce rebuilds the part of you that got worn down by waiting. Every consequence you enforce restores your self-trust, and self-trust is the foundation of secure love. So yes, they get shocked, because your old pattern was availability, and your new pattern is boundaries with consequences. And whether they rise to meet that, or they disappear, your win is the same. You stop being the person who can be taken for granted. You stop being the person who keeps the door open while being hurt. You stop being the person who teaches others how to treat you poorly and still keep you. You become the person who is kind, loving, warm, but no longer endlessly accessible to inconsistency. And that is not just a change, that is a return to your dignity. Silence becomes power when it's not a tactic, it's self-respect. You refuse to chase what keeps running, and I need you to understand the difference, because this is where most people get lost. They think silence is a game. They think silence is manipulation. They think silence is, how do I make them miss me? And sometimes, yes, people use silence like a weapon. They disappear to punish. They withdraw to control. They go quiet to create anxiety in someone else. But what I'm talking about is something completely different. I'm talking about the kind of silence that happens when your heart finally gets tired of pleading for basic presence. That silence is not strategy. That silence is surrender, not surrender to them, surrender to reality. Reality that you cannot keep chasing someone into loving you. Reality that you cannot keep explaining your worth to someone who benefits from misunderstanding you. Reality that you cannot keep offering your softness to someone who uses distance as a shield. Reality that you cannot keep turning your life into an emergency room for someone who keeps wounding you and then returning for comfort. And when that reality lands, your silence stops being dramatic and starts being grounded. It becomes a boundary you don't need to shout. It becomes a decision you don't need to defend. Because chasing is exhausting in a way that people don't talk about. It's not just the messages you send, it's the mental labor. It's the hours of replaying, the constant decoding, the way your mind becomes obsessed with timing and tone, the way your stomach tightens every time your phone lights up, and every time it doesn't, the way you start living on the edge of hope, the way you start measuring your worth in response speed, the way you become a version of yourself that is always bracing for rejection. Chasing doesn't just drain your energy, it drains your identity. And avoidant dynamics feed on that chasing, because chasing makes them feel in control. When you chase, you communicate something without meaning to. You communicate that they can withdraw and still keep you. That they can go cold and still have access. That they can delay and you will wait. That they can do the minimum and still receive the maximum. Again, not always because they are evil, but because the pattern rewards them. Their nervous system learns that distance gives relief and doesn't cost anything. Your nervous system learns that chasing gives temporary contact, but costs your peace. And you keep repeating because you think contact is love, but contact without respect is just a cycle. So when you stop chasing, the silence becomes powerful because it removes the reward. It removes the comfort of your predictability. It removes the certainty that you'll still be there holding the thread. It removes the emotional insurance policy they were relying on. But most importantly, it gives you your nervous system back. Because the true power of silence is not what it does to them, it's what it does to you. It breaks the addiction. It breaks the habit of reaching for someone else to calm your anxiety. It breaks the pattern of outsourcing your peace to a person who keeps making you unstable. It's like you finally take your hand off the hot stove, and at first it hurts because you've been burned so many times, but then the skin starts to heal, and that healing can feel like emptiness before it feels like peace. Because when you've been chasing, your life has been full of movement, not healthy movement, anxious movement, full of reaching, full of checking, full of trying, full of hoping, and when you stop, suddenly there is space, and in that space you feel everything you've been avoiding: grief, anger, loneliness, disappointment, the truth that you gave more than you received, the truth that you stayed longer than you should have, the truth that you kept forgiving what kept repeating, the truth that you wanted to be chosen, but you were treated like an option, and the silence forces you to face that truth, not to punish you, but to free you. This is why self-respect is the source of real silence. Self-respect is not loud. Self-respect doesn't need to convince. Self-respect doesn't negotiate. Self-respect simply stops participating. It's you saying, I'm not going to fight for a relationship with someone who keeps stepping out of it. I'm not going to chase someone who runs every time closeness asks something of them. I'm not going to keep sending love into a void, and then blaming myself when it echoes back empty. I'm not going to keep shrinking so you don't feel pressured. I'm not going to keep being understanding while I'm being neglected. And here's the part that becomes your strength. When your silence is self-respect, you stop needing them to respond for you to feel okay. You stop needing their message to validate your value. You stop needing their return to prove you mattered. You stop letting their distance decide whether you breathe today. You start building a life that doesn't revolve around being chosen. You start building a life where you choose yourself daily, in small ways. You eat, you sleep, you work, you laugh, you pray, you move your body, you reconnect with people who don't make you beg for basic care. Now, will your silence shock them? Yes, it might. Because they were used to your chasing. They were used to your softness returning even after they disappeared. They were used to being able to drift and still be welcomed back. So when you go silent, it can make them feel the loss of control. It can make them feel the weight of consequence. It can make them curious. It can even make them chase. But listen, their reaction is not the measure of your power. Your power is in your consistency. Your power is in not breaking your silence because you miss them for one night. Your power is in not reopening the door because they knock once. Your power is in not trading your peace for a temporary hit of attention. Because if you use silence as a tactic, you will break it the moment you get anxious. If you use silence as self-respect, you will hold it with love for yourself, even when it hurts. You will hold it because you finally understand that chasing is not love, chasing is fear. And you are done living in fear. So silence becomes power when it's not a tactic, it's self-respect. It's you refusing to chase what keeps running. It's you refusing to beg for the basics. It's you refusing to be emotionally available to someone who is emotionally unavailable. It's you stepping out of a cycle that trained your heart to accept crumbs. And even if they never come back, your silence still wins, because it brings you back to yourself, and being back with yourself is the first time you truly feel safe again. The cutoff forces reality. Either they rise into accountability, or they lose access to you permanently, and that is why it feels so intense, because reality is the one thing an avoidant pattern tries to delay. Reality is the conversation. Reality is the ownership. Reality is the uncomfortable truth that someone got hurt. Reality is the moment where excuses stop working. Reality is the moment where space can't be used as a cover for emotional neglect. And when you cut off cleanly, you remove all the soft landings, you remove the loopholes, you remove the option to disappear and return as if nothing happened. You create a fork in the road, grow or lose me. And I know how scary that fork feels for you too, because a part of you still loves them. A part of you still hopes. A part of you still wants the story where they finally realize and come back changed. But your cutoff is not just about what they do, it's about what you refuse to do anymore. You refuse to keep your heart in a place where it's treated casually. You refuse to keep teaching someone that your love is unlimited even when your peace is being destroyed. You refuse to keep making room for inconsistency, and that refusal creates reality. Before the cutoff, reality was blurred because you kept cushioning the impact. You kept giving chances without change. You kept reconnecting without repair. You kept accepting, "I'm busy," when what you needed was clarity. You kept swallowing disappointment so you wouldn't look needy. You kept pretending you were okay with half effort, because you were afraid that asking for more would make them run. So the dynamic stayed in limbo. They could keep one foot in and one foot out, and you would still be emotionally present, still waiting, still hoping. That is not love. That is suspense. And suspense is addictive because it keeps you chasing the next moment of warmth. The cutoff ends the suspense. It turns a blurry story into a clear one. It says, we are not doing the in-between anymore. Either we do this with maturity or we don't do it at all. Either you show up with accountability or you lose access. Either you can handle the truth or you don't get the privilege of my presence. And to someone avoidant, that can feel like pressure, not because you are demanding too much, but because pressure is what they feel when they can't control the pace. They want closeness on their terms, distance on their terms, reconnection on their terms, and your cutoff removes that control. That's why the cutoff forces reality, because now they have to face the consequence of their behavior. If they want you back, they can't just drift back in with a casual, hey. They can't just send an emoji and expect the door to open. They can't just appear when they're lonely and disappear when it gets real. They have to rise into accountability. They have to step into the uncomfortable conversation. They have to name what happened. They have to validate your experience. They have to apologize in a way that changes behavior. They have to prove consistency over time. They have to show you that they can handle intimacy without running the moment their nervous system gets activated. And this is where you must become very honest with yourself, because accountability is not an apology. An apology can be words. Accountability is change. Accountability is them recognizing patterns, not just moments. Accountability is them saying, I know I withdrew, and I understand how that hurt you, and then doing the work to communicate differently. Accountability is them being willing to feel discomfort instead of escaping it. Accountability is them staying in the room during hard conversations instead of disappearing. Accountability is them respecting your boundaries, not testing them. Accountability is them moving slower if needed to rebuild trust, not rushing you back into intimacy to soothe their guilt. But if they cannot rise into that, if they want you back without reality, then they lose access. And that loss is not cruelty, it is consequence. It is you refusing to keep participating in a cycle that taught your heart to accept emotional neglect as normal. It is you choosing a love that does not require you to suffer silently. It is you choosing a relationship that can hold truth, because a relationship that cannot hold truth cannot hold you. If they can't face what they did, they can't protect you from it happening again. If they can't repair, they can't maintain. If they can't take responsibility, they can't be safe. Now, I want you to understand something important. The cutoff doesn't only force reality for them, it forces reality for you. Because when you cut off, you face the raw grief. You face the loneliness. You face the part of you that still wants to reach out. You face the part of you that still wants closure. You face the temptation to reopen the door just to feel relief for a night. You face the fear that you might be too much for wanting basic consistency. And this is where your growth happens, because you learn that discomfort is survivable. You learn that you can miss someone and still not go back. You learn that love is not proven by how much pain you tolerate. You learn that your worth is not measured by whether someone returns. You learn that you can stand in the truth without collapsing. And when you stand in that truth, you become unshakable, not hard, unshakable. Unshakable means you don't let a burst of attention erase your standards. Unshakable means you don't let nostalgia rewrite reality. Unshakable means you don't trade your peace for a temporary hit of contact. Unshakable means you don't reopen the door without accountability. Unshakable means you can say, I care about you, and still say, I will not do the old pattern again. So if they come back, the test is simple. Can they meet reality with maturity? Can they meet your boundary with respect? Can they meet your pain with compassion? Can they meet your standard with consistency? Because if they rise into accountability, a new relationship can be built, not on chasing and withdrawing, but on repair and truth. But if they don't, if they keep trying to bypass reality, then they lose access. Not because you hate them, but because you finally love yourself enough to stop letting your heart be the place where someone practices their avoidance. And that is what makes a cutoff powerful. It forces reality. It makes love real, or it makes the ending real. It stops the limbo. It stops the waiting. It stops the quiet erosion of your self-respect. It gives you back your life. And even if they never rise, even if they never return, you still win, because you stop living in the in-between. and you finally step into a future that is built on something solid: your dignity, your standards, your peace, and the kind of love that doesn't require you to beg for what should be freely given.